The tourist mocked the guardsman, brazenly crossing the line. But when the real guard spoke, the crowd fell silent. The consequences turned into an unexpected lesson for everyone. In front of Buckingham Palace, the familiar chaos reigned. Crowds of tourists armed with phones jostled to get closer to the white lines, all vying for the perfect shot. It seemed like every corner of the square was packed with those eager to witness the magnificent British spectacle. Everything was going as expected, until he appeared in the crowd. Michael, a lean man in his 40s, sporting a baseball cap emblazoned with the American flag, a loud declaration of his patriotism, was hard to miss in his bright orange jacket and jeans. He drew attention like a neon sign. Michael, who had clearly overindulged during lunch, swayed and laughed boisterously. His exaggerated shouts of, "Oh, look, it's the palace! Big Ben, move over!" blended with his drunken chuckles. Standing in front of the palace was a true symbol of tradition, a royal guardsman. Clad in his immaculate red tunic, tailored to perfection, with black trousers bearing sharp stripes and the iconic bearskin hat, he embodied British grandeur. His stone-carved face remained unmoving as he stood tall, unfazed by the swarm of curious eyes, cameras, and noise surrounding him. But to Michael, this wasn't a person. No, to him, the guardsman was just a prop. "Ha! Look, is that even a real person?" Michael shouted, teetering dangerously between laughter and falling. "He's just a clown in a costume." The crowd burst into laughter. Some even joined in. After all, who doesn't love a spectacle? Feeling encouraged, Michael puffed out his chest. His smug grin, broadcasting, "Watch me entertain everyone," irritated those who had come to respectfully observe the tradition. Yet others were already pulling out their phones, ready to capture the show. "Hey everyone, watch this. I'll show you how it's done," he proclaimed with theatrical flair, gesturing dramatically toward the guardsman. The guardsman, still as bronze, didn't flinch. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, as if nothing was happening. But in his stillness, there was an unsettling intensity. It wasn't indifference. It was discipline. Michael, however, interpreted the silence as dismissal, and it irked him. "Come on, buddy. What, you think you're too important to entertain us regular folks?" The crowd's laughter grew louder. Some waved him off and moved on, shaking their heads disapprovingly. But those who stayed began to egg him on. "Go on, Michael. Show him who's boss." Feeling like a star, Michael stepped forward, his arms waving as if announcing the start of his performance. In his mind, he was the main attraction, a tourist paying good money to be entertained, the king of this show. But the reality was different. In front of him stood not an actor, not a prop, and not a mere attraction. He faced a man who had dedicated his life to service and upholding tradition. And if Michael thought he was in charge, this day was about to teach him a lesson. The guardsman, of course, didn't respond, but in his silence there was more weight than words could ever convey. Still basking in the attention of the crowd, Michael spotted a souvenir stall nearby. His face lit up with inspiration. Clearly, a brilliant idea had struck him. Stumbling through the crowd, he loudly exchanged words with the vendor. "Hey, I need something like his. You know, the hat, the coat, everything." The vendor, no stranger to such antics, sighed heavily and pointed silently to a rack of cheap toy accessories. Minutes later, Michael returned to the square, now decked out in his new uniform. He wore a crookedly fastened, obviously child-sized guardsman costume, and a comically oversized fake bearskin hat that barely stayed on his head. The whole getup was so absurd that the crowd erupted in laughter. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for the real show," Michael declared, throwing his arms out as if expecting a standing ovation. He marched closer to the real guardsman, stopping a few steps away. With a smug grin, he straightened his posture, or tried to, and struck a mock guard stance. "Behold, the new guard has arrived," he announced, winking at the crowd. The audience buzzed with approval. Some began filming, children clapped, and a few shouted encouragement. Yet the laughter now carried an undertone of discomfort. Who even does this? Many likely thought. Michael, energized by the spotlight, began performing a parody of the changing of the guard. He marched clumsily back and forth, attempting to mimic the sharp movements of a real guardsman. His exaggerated steps, however, looked more like a bad slapstick routine than anything remotely disciplined. "Hey, buddy," someone called from the crowd. "Your hat's slipping." Michael hastily adjusted his toy hat, nearly knocking it off, and quipped, "Doesn't matter. It's all about style, not details. Watch and learn." The crowd laughed again, but less enthusiastically. Whispers of disapproval began to ripple through the group. "What a disgrace," muttered an elderly woman, shaking her head. The real guardsman, throughout this, remained motionless, a statue of focus and dignity. His unwavering gaze, though emotionless, carried an unmistakable air of authority. Without uttering a word, he conveyed what the crowd already knew. This was beneath him. But Michael wasn't done. Emboldened by his drunken bravado, he edged closer to the guardsman, crossing an unspoken boundary that everyone else had respected. The crowd held its breath. "Hey, pal, you're standing too straight. Let me teach you how to relax," Michael exclaimed, reaching out as if to adjust the guardsman's posture. An oppressive silence fell over the square. Cameras clicked nervously, and a few murmurs could be heard. "This has gone too far." At that moment, it was clear. Michael had crossed a line. Michael, brimming with his self-proclaimed greatness, stepped forward, crossing the invisible but deeply significant boundary between the crowd and the guardsman. He found himself face to face with an unyielding symbol of British tradition. It seemed he had completely forgotten that he was not dealing with a prop, but with a man trained in discipline and resilience. "Hey, old man!" Michael shouted loudly, nearly losing his balance but managing to steady himself. "Are you even alive? Or are you under some spell? Maybe crack a smile for once. It's not like you're at a funeral." The crowd went silent. Someone let out a nervous laugh, the kind that suggested they weren't quite sure if they should be amused. Most likely, many were thinking, "Who does this? This is going way too far." Michael didn't notice the shift in the crowd's mood. To him, this was still a performance, and the crowd was his audience, waiting to be entertained. His face twisted into a comical grimace as he pretended to reach for the guardsman's hat. And then, something unexpected happened. Before Michael's fingers could touch the iconic bearskin hat, the guardsman stepped forward. That single step seemed louder than any of the laughter or shouts that had come before. "Step back behind the line!" boomed the guardsman, his voice sharp, commanding, and as startling as thunder on a clear day. The crowd gasped. In an instant, Michael recoiled as if struck. His eyes widened in shock. Clearly, he hadn't expected the guardsman to speak. But instead of backing down, Michael tried to salvage his show. His face turned red, and his voice, now less confident, climbed to a shout. "Oh, so you think you're the boss here? You're just standing there, doing nothing. I could be a guardsman, too." With that, he awkwardly grabbed at his ridiculous parody hat, mockingly pretending to salute. But his movements were so clumsy they looked more like a drunken pantomime than anything resembling respect. The real guardsman took another step forward. His movement was precise, deliberate, and honed by years of training. He raised his hand and pointed toward the white line that marked the boundary between him and Michael. "Crossing the line is punishable. Step back," he said, his voice cold and calm, carrying a chill that seemed to freeze the very air around him. The crowd stood still, enveloped in an almost eerie silence broken only by the faint clicks of cameras. A few people inched backward, as though they too felt the weight of the moment. Michael, however, took it as a challenge. His face contorted in anger, and his voice turned shrill.
"Oh, you think you can intimidate me? I'm a tourist. I pay taxes. Well, in America. But I pay taxes." With those words, he took another step forward, now standing almost nose to nose with the guardsman. His hands twitched toward the bearskin hat once more, but at that moment, the guardsman made the subtlest shift. His shoulders tensed ever so slightly. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The crowd understood its meaning without the need for words. "This is a circus," someone in the crowd muttered, shaking their head. The rest of the onlookers watched in silence, holding their breath. Even the children, who had been giggling loudly moments before, fell quiet. It was as if everyone collectively sensed that this was no longer just a silly drunken stunt, but something much more serious. The guardsman remained perfectly still, his gaze icy and focused. It was so intense that, for a fleeting moment, Michael seemed to reconsider his actions. But it was only a moment. His alcohol-fueled bravado and bruised ego quickly drowned out any second thoughts. "All right then," Michael muttered, trying to keep his composure. "Let's see who's the real professional here." He struck an exaggerated military pose, wobbling slightly as he attempted to mimic the guardsman's discipline. The crowd watched, anticipation thick in the air. What had begun as a comedy was now charged with tension. The tone of the spectacle entirely changed. The crowd erupted in support of the guardsman. Someone from the spectators shouted, "Michael, stop it! You're crossing the line!" "Come on, soldier, show him how it's done." Michael, ignoring the cries from the crowd, took another step forward, blatantly disregarding the situation. Once again, he reached out toward the guardsman's hat, and that's when something happened that no one expected. The guardsman, who had stood perfectly still and disciplined until now, suddenly spoke. His voice, loud and commanding, like a roll of thunder, broke through the tense silence. "Stand back! Guard on duty!" The words were sharp and concise, immediately capturing everyone's attention. The crowd froze, suddenly aware of the seriousness of the moment. Michael, too, seemed to realize just how far he had gone. "Hey, I'm just joking," he stammered, attempting a smile, but his expression betrayed his confusion and unease. Within moments, two security officers in sharp black suits with radios clipped to their belts moved quickly through the barriers toward the scene. Their movements were swift and precise, as if they'd handled situations like this many times before. "What's going on here?" one of them asked calmly yet firmly. He was a tall man with a stern expression. "This individual has breached the boundary and is acting disrespectfully," the guardsman stated curtly, maintaining his pose and unshakable demeanor. Michael threw up his hands, his voice rising in protest. "Come on, guys! I'm just a tourist! I didn't touch anything!" The crowd immediately responded. "He's lying! We all saw it! It's all on video!" One of the security officers firmly, yet without aggression, took Michael by the arm. "Sir, you need to leave the premises, immediately." "What? Are you serious?" Michael exclaimed indignantly, but it was clear no one was taking him seriously anymore. The crowd jeered with sarcastic remarks flying. "Pay your taxes in America, then act up there. What a disgrace." The officers, unfazed by Michael's protests, escorted him away from the square. His clumsy resistance only made the situation more absurd, drawing laughter and derision from the onlookers. As Michael, still shouting something about his tourist rights, was led out of the square by the security officers, the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind a hum of chatter and flashes of cameras. His protests were drowned out by the jeers of the spectators, who now seemed to enjoy the spectacle more than ever. "That's what happens when you try to turn tradition into a joke," someone from the crowd said, drawing a round of laughter. And the guardsman? He remained in his position, as if the entire bizarre incident had never happened. His stance, still impeccable and resolute, once again drew the attention of the onlookers. Those who had been filming Michael's antics now turned their cameras toward the true professional, standing proud in his role as the guardian of British tradition. One woman,
holding her child's hand, spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "This is why we respect people like him. They're not just guarding the palace, they're guarding history." Her child looked up at her and whispered, "Mom, is he like the king? Is he royal too?" "Yes, sweetheart," the woman replied with warmth. "But he's the real kind." The guardsman didn't flinch, but in his stillness was a quiet power that spoke volumes. Only when the crowd began to thin out did he make the slightest adjustment to his iconic bearskin hat, restoring it to its perfect position. It was a barely noticeable movement, yet it seemed to put the final punctuation mark on the story. The crowd responded immediately with a round of applause, loud and genuine. Someone shouted, "A true professional! Well done, mate. Keep it up." Even those who had initially cheered for Michael now realized just how ridiculous his behavior had been. The guardsman became a symbol of discipline and dignity, a rare quality in a world where such values often go overlooked. Michael's antics quickly spread across social media. Within hours, videos surfaced on platforms like TikTok and Instagram with captions such as, "Drunk tourist versus royal guardsman, guess who won?" or "Unshakable, how one soldier shut down a clown." The comments under the posts spoke volumes. "This is the true British spirit. Respect to the guardsman. Michael, go home. British tradition isn't for you." And Michael? Perhaps he gained a fleeting moment of internet fame, but for most, he remained the drunken tourist who failed to understand that honor and dignity aren't things you can buy. The guardsman, meanwhile, continued his post as if nothing had happened. Because for him, this wasn't just a job, it was service. A service that doesn't falter, even when faced with the foolishness of others.